When police finally found his cabin deep in the Redwood National Forest, they discovered evidence of 17 murders. Bodies buried in numbered graves. Personal belongings catalogued with dates and times. A journal detailing every kill with clinical precision. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the evidence of what had done. It was the evidence of what he was still planning. 23 empty graves had already been dug, each one marked with a name. And 6 of those names belonged to the hikers who'd reported finding the cabin 3 days earlier. 3 experienced hikers set out on a week-long backpacking trip through the most remote sections of Northern California's coastal forest. Nathan, 35, now emergency room physician who hiked to escape the stress of saving lives. His sister Claire, 32, a high school teacher who documented nature through watercolor paintings. And their childhood friend Marcus, 34, a software engineer who used wilderness trips to disconnect from technology. They'd been hiking together for 15 years, had covered hundreds of miles of trails across the western states. They trusted each other completely. They trusted the wilderness. That trust would almost kill them. The trail started at a registered campground but would take them 40 miles into backcountry that saw fewer than 20 visitors per year. Their route followed now abandoned Fire Road for the first day, then branched onto primitive trails that were barely maintained, finally entering true wilderness where no marked path existed. They carried GPS devices, satellite communicators, and enough supplies for 10 days. They'd filed their route plan with rangers. They'd taken every precaution. They were as prepared as humans could be for a week in the wild. The first 2 days were perfect. They covered 22 miles through old-growth forest, camped beside crystal streams, saw black bears from safe distances, and found solitude that was increasingly rare in now overcrowded world. Claire filled her sketchbook with watercolors of ferns and wildflowers. Marcus photographed the cathedral-like groves of ancient redwoods. Nathan finally felt the tension of the ER leaving his shoulders. The forest was healing them, as it always did. They had no idea they were being watched. On the evening of the 3rd day, they made camp in a small clearing beside a creek, 15 miles from the nearest marked trail. They built a fire, cooked dinner, and were settling in for the night when Marcus noticed something odd. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth near the creek, leading upstream. The prints were recent, maybe hours old, and they were large, belonging to someone significantly bigger than any of them. This deep in the wilderness, encountering another hiker was unusual but not impossible. What made Marcus uneasy was that the prints showed the person had been standing still for a long time, watching their campsite from the trees. They decided to follow the boot prints the next morning, curious about who else was hiking this remote area. The trail led upstream for half a mile, then turned away from the creek into dense forest. The prints were joined by drag marks, as if the person had been pulling something heavy. Nathan wanted to turn back, but Claire's curiosity won out. They followed the disturbed ground for another quarter mile until the forest opened into a clearing that stopped all 3 of them in their tracks. A cabin stood in the center of the clearing. Not an old abandoned structure, but a relatively new building, maybe 10 years old, constructed from milled lumber that had obviously been hauled in piece by piece. Solar panels on the roof. A satellite dish. A generator shed. A large woodpile covered with tarps. This wasn't a casual shelter. This was a permanent residence, miles from any road, hidden so deep in the forest that it wouldn't appear on any map. Someone lived here. Someone who wanted to be very far from civilization. The cabin appeared empty. No smoke from the chimney. No sound from inside. The windows were shuttered. Marcus called out, announcing their presence, apologizing for the intrusion. No response. The door was unlocked, which seemed strange for such now isolated dwelling. They debated leaving, respecting the occupant's privacy, but Nathan argued that someone living this far from help might need assistance. What if the resident was injured? Sick? They had a moral obligation to check. So they opened the door and stepped inside. What they found would haunt them forever. The cabin's interior was obsessively organized. One room served as living space with a cot, a table, and shelves of canned goods. Another room held tools, hunting equipment, and camping gear. Everything was labeled, dated, arranged with military precision. But it was the third room, the one with a padlocked door that Marcus forced open, that revealed the truth. The walls were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them. Hikers on trails. Campers at sites. People who thought they were alone in the wilderness. All photographed from a distance without their knowledge. And beneath each photo, written in careful handwriting, were dates and locations. Claire recognized one of the faces immediately. A woman had been reported missing 2 years ago, her disappearance widely covered in news. The photo showed her hiking alone, unaware she was being watched. The date written below was 3 days before she vanished. Marcus found another familiar face. A couple had disappeared on their honeymoon hike 18 months earlier. Their photo showed them setting up camp, smiling, in love, with no idea that someone was documenting them from the shadows. The cabin wasn't just a residence. It was a hunting blind. And they were standing in a serial killer's lair. They tore through the cabin, searching for more evidence, hoping they were wrong, praying this was some bizarre misunderstanding. But every new discovery confirmed the horror. A filing cabinet contained folders for each victim, meticulously organized. Maps with marked locations. Newspaper clippings about missing hikers. Personal items, a woman's watch, a man's wedding ring, a child's compass. Trophies taken from people had never been found. And in the bottom drawer, a journal. Nathan opened it with shaking hands and began to read. The journal entries were clinical, detached, describing murders the way a scientist might document experiments. Each entry detailed the victim's behavior, their routines, their weaknesses. How long had observed them before making his move? What mistakes they'd made that gave him opportunities. The kill methods varied, but the approach was always the same: days or weeks of surveillance, learning everything about his prey, then striking when they were most vulnerable. 17 entries total. 17 people had come to the forest seeking peace and found death instead. Claire found a large map on the wall of the locked room. Red pins marked locations throughout the forest, scattered across hundreds of square miles. Each pin had a number. She counted them. 17 red pins. But there were also blue pins. 23 of them. Future hunting grounds. Places where he planned to kill again. And beside the map was a list. Names and descriptions. People had identified as potential victims. People he was currently watching, studying, stalking. Marcus grabbed the list and his blood froze. The last 3 entries described them. Their names, their physical descriptions, their camping location from the previous night. They were on his list. Had been watching them. The boot prints near their camp hadn't been a random encounter. Had been there, observing them, deciding if they were suitable victims. And they'd just broken into his cabin, contaminated his sanctuary, made themselves urgent threats to his secrecy. They needed to leave. Now. Immediately. Before he returned. They ran for the door, and that's when they heard it. Nah, engine. A vehicle approaching on a trail they hadn't known existed. He was coming back. And they were trapped in his cabin with all the evidence of their intrusion. They had seconds to decide. Run and be seen, or hide and hope he didn't discover them. Nathan made the choice, pushing Claire and Marcus toward a storage closet in the back room. They crammed inside, pulling the door nearly shut, leaving just enough gap to see through. The journal and map were still out on the table. Evidence of their intrusion was everywhere. But there was no time to fix it. The engine sound stopped. A truck door slammed. Heavy footsteps approached the cabin. They held their breath and waited. The man who entered was massive, at least 6'5", broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in isolation. He wore hunting clothes, carried a rifle, and had a deer carcass slung over one shoulder. He deposited the deer outside, then came back in, and immediately froze. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in every detail. The forced lock on the inner room. The open journal. The disturbed filing cabinet. His face showed no emotion, but his body language changed. Muscles tensed. Hand moved to the hunting knife on his belt. He knew someone had been here. And he knew they might still be. He searched systematically, checking every space large enough to hide a person. Under the cot. Behind the shelves. In the tool room. He moved with practiced efficiency. Someone had hunted humans before, who understood how prey behaved when cornered. The three hikers pressed deeper into the closet, trying to make themselves smaller, to quiet their breathing, to become invisible. Through the gap in the door, Nathan could see the killer approaching their hiding spot. 3 more steps. 2 more. 1 more. His hand reached for the closet door handle. A radio crackled to life on the killer's belt. A ranger's voice, distorted by static, announcing they were conducting a wellness check in the area, asking if anyone was monitoring the frequency. The killer's hand stopped on the closet handle. He pulled the radio free, stepped away from the closet, and responded in a calm, friendly voice. Yes, he was monitoring. No, he hadn't seen any hikers in distress. Yes, had keep an eye out. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. 90 seconds that saved 3 lives. When it ended, the killer looked at the closet door again, seemed to reconsider, then grabbed his rifle and walked outside. They waited 5 minutes after the engine sounds faded before moving. Every second felt like an hour. When they finally emerged from the closet, their legs were cramped, their clothes soaked with sweat. They'd escaped detection by pure luck. The radio call had saved them. But the killer knew someone had been in his cabin. Had be back with more time to search. Or worse, he might already be circling back, setting up an ambush. They had to leave the area immediately. Not just the cabin, but this entire section of forest. They needed to reach help before he found them. They ran. Not on trails, but straight through the forest, using GPS to navigate toward the nearest fire road 6 miles west. The terrain was brutal, steep ravines, dense undergrowth, fallen logs, and creek crossings. They fell repeatedly, got tangled in brush, scraped their skin on thorns and branches. But fear drove them forward. Behind them, somewhere in that vast forest, was a man who had killed 17 people and had just discovered evidence that witnesses to his crimes were nearby. They couldn't stop. Couldn't rest. Couldn't slow down. After 3 hours of brutal cross-country hiking, Marcus' GPS showed they'd covered only 2 miles. The forest was fighting them. Claire had twisted her ankle badly crossing a creek. Nathan had gashed his arm on a broken branch. Marcus was limping from an old knee injury that the rough terrain had aggravated. They were breaking down physically, leaving a trail of disturbed vegetation that anyone with tracking skills could follow easily. And the killer had proven he had skills. Had survived years in this wilderness. Hunting them would be trivial for someone with his experience. They stopped to check their position and make a plan. The satellite communicator could call for help, but rescue would take hours, maybe a full day given their remote location. Meanwhile, calling for rescue would reveal their exact coordinates to any authority monitoring emergency frequencies. And they had no way to know if the killer monitored those frequencies too. If he did, had know exactly where they were. Nathan argued for making the call anyway. Better to risk him knowing than to guarantee he'd find them through tracking. Claire agreed. Marcus activated the emergency beacon and sent their coordinates with a message, found evidence of serial killer. In immediate danger. Send police. The response came within 15 minutes. A text message confirming rescue dispatch and advising them to stay put. Estimated arrival, 4 hours. 4 hours of remaining stationary, visible, vulnerable. They discussed moving anyway, putting more distance between themselves and the cabin, but Claire's ankle was swelling badly. She couldn't maintain the pace they'd been setting. They were trapped by injury and terrain, waiting for help that seemed impossibly far away. And then they heard something that turned their blood to ice. A voice. His voice. Calling out to them. The killer's voice carried through the forest with unsettling calm. He wasn't shouting or threatening. He spoke conversationally, as if addressing friends. He said he understood they were scared. Said he knew they'd found his cabin. Said they'd misunderstood what they'd seen. He wanted to talk. To explain. To make sure they understood he wasn't a threat to them. His tone was reasonable, almost kind. But the words were a hunter's strategy. Making prey feel safe. Encouraging them to reveal their position. To trust. To make a fatal mistake. The voice was getting closer. Not directly toward them, but in a search pattern, casting back and forth, narrowing the area. He was tracking them using sound, trying to provoke a response, listening for movement. Nathan signaled the others to absolute silence. They crouched low in a thicket of ferns, trying to become invisible. The killer passed within 30 yards of their position, still talking in that calm, friendly voice. Still promising he just wanted to talk. Still hunting. They could see him now through the vegetation. He had his rifle ready. This wasn't a conversation. This was an execution waiting to happen. He moved past them, his search pattern taking him slightly away from their hiding spot. They'd avoided detection again. But he was between them and the fire road now, cutting off their escape route. Worse, his tracking had revealed their general direction. He knew they were heading west, toward the road, toward rescue. He could set up ahead of them, create an ambush, wait for them to walk into his kill zone. They were being herded, manipulated, driven toward a location of his choosing. The hunter had become the architect of their death. Nathan realized their mistake. They'd been running predictably, heading straight for the nearest road like wounded animals fleeing toward perceived safety. But the killer understood wilderness psychology. He knew frightened people took the most direct route toward help. So they needed to do the unexpected. Marcus suggested backtracking, circling around, approaching the fire road from a different angle. It would add miles and hours, but it might save their lives. Claire could barely walk, but adrenaline and survival instinct would have to compensate for her injury. They began moving east, away from rescue, betting everything on outthinking a man who'd successfully hunted 17 people. They moved with agonizing slowness, prioritizing silence over speed. Every step was calculated. Every broken twig was a potential death sentence. The killer was still out there, somewhere in the forest, listening. One sound, one careless moment, and he'd add just his search pattern, find them, end them. Now hour passed. Then two. They'd circled a mile east and were beginning to curve back north, hoping to pass behind the killer's assumed position. Claire was crying silently from pain, biting her sleeve to muffle sounds. Marcus supported her weight. Nathan led, checking GPS every few minutes, adjusting their route to avoid open areas where they'd be visible. A twig snapped ahead of them. They froze instantly, dropping low. Silence. Then movement. Something large pushing through brush. The killer had anticipated their maneuver. Head circled too, positioning himself in their new path, waiting. Head outthought them. Outmaneuvered them. Proven why Head survived as a predator for years while his victims died. Nathan could see a shape through the trees now, 20 yards ahead. Man-sized. Moving slowly. Searching. The gap between hunter and prey had narrowed to seconds. This was the endgame. One way or another, it would end here. Nathan gripped a heavy branch he'd picked up earlier, the only weapon they had. Marcus held a rock. Claire clutched her trekking pole like a spear. Pathetic defenses against a man with a rifle and years of killing experience. The shape moved closer, pushing through ferns, clearly tracking something. 10 yards now. They could hear breathing. Heavy. Controlled. Predatory. Nathan prepared to charge. Better to die fighting than executed while cowering. He tensed his muscles, ready to spring. And then the shape emerged from the ferns. It was a bear. A black bear, probably 400 pounds, foraging for food, completely uninterested in the humans. It snorted once, registered their presence, and ambled away through the forest without concern. The three hikers remained frozen for a full minute after it disappeared, their minds struggling to process the shift from certain death to bizarre salvation. They'd been seconds from attacking a bear with sticks and rocks, which would have created noise, revealed their position, and brought the real killer down on them. Luck had saved them again. But luck was a finite resource. Eventually, it would run out. Marcus had a realization. They'd been so focused on escape they'd forgotten something crucial: evidence. The cabin contained proof of 17 murders. Proof that could bring justice for all those victims. But if the killer realized police were coming, he'd destroy everything. Burn the cabin. Bury the evidence. Disappear into the wilderness and start over somewhere else. Someone needed to make sure that didn't happen. Someone needed to go back to the cabin while rescue was en route and document everything before it could be destroyed. Nathan rejected the idea immediately. Going back was suicide. The killer was between them and the cabin, actively hunting. But Marcus argued that splitting up made strategic sense. The killer was one man. He couldn't track 3 different targets simultaneously. If 2 people continued toward the fire road as decoys, drawing his attention, one person could circle back to the cabin. Document the evidence with photographs. Then leave a different direction entirely. It was risky, but it gave them options. And it ensured the killer couldn't erase what he'd done. Claire said she'd go back. Her injury made her a liability in a running escape anyway. Better to use her limitations strategically. They split up. Nathan and Marcus would continue toward the fire road, making noise deliberately now, creating a trail for the killer to follow. Claire would wait an hour, then backtrack toward the cabin using a wide circular route. She'd photograph everything, upload images to cloud storage via satellite communicator, then hike south toward a different fire road. If everything went perfectly, the killer would chase Nathan and Marcus while Claire documented his crimes. If anything went wrong, they'd likely all die. But doing nothing guaranteed the killer would escape justice. This was their only chance to stop him permanently. Claire's journey back was agony. Her ankle had swollen to the size of a grapefruit. Each step sent lightning bolts of pain up her leg. But she pushed forward, using her trekking pole as a crutch, taking a route that arced wide around where they'd last heard the killer's voice. She moved slowly, stopping frequently to listen, terrified of encountering him alone. Without Nathan and Marcus, she felt exposed, vulnerable. Every sound became a potential threat. Every shadow could hide death. But she continued. The faces in those photographs deserved justice. The families of the missing deserved answers. And 3 more names weren't going to be added to his victim list if she could help it. 2 hours later, she reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. It appeared empty. No truck. No smoke. No signs of activity. He was still out hunting Nathan and Marcus. She had a window of opportunity, but no idea how long it would last. She approached cautiously, eyes scanning for tripwires or alarms. A man this paranoid might have the cabin booby-trapped. But she found nothing. The door was still unlocked. Inside, everything was as they'd left it. The journal open. The filing cabinet disturbed. He hadn't returned to clean up yet. He was still confident he'd catch the intruders in the forest. That confidence gave Claire the time she needed. She photographed everything. Every page of the journal. Every victim's folder. Every photograph on the wall. The map with its red and blue pins. The trophies in the cabinet. She worked systematically, knowing this evidence could put the killer away forever. Her satellite communicator uploaded each image automatically to cloud storage, creating a permanent record that couldn't be destroyed even if she was killed. 20 minutes of photographing. 30. 40. She was thorough, methodical, despite the fear screaming at her to run. This was too important to rush. Too important to miss anything. In the back of the locked room, behind a shelf of supplies, Claire found something the three of them had missed in their initial panic. A trapdoor leading to a cellar. She almost left it unexplored, her mission already accomplished, but journalist instinct made her investigate. She opened the trapdoor and descended rough wooden stairs into darkness. Her flashlight beam revealed a space that made the cabin above seem almost innocent. This was where he'd brought some of his victims while they were still alive. Chains bolted to walls. A metal table with restraints. Tools arranged with surgical precision. This wasn't just a killer. This was a torturer. Someone who'd made his victims suffer before ending them. And in the corner, secured to the wall with chains, was a woman. Alive. Barely conscious, severely dehydrated, injuries visible even in the dim light. She'd been reported missing 3 weeks ago, a solo hiker who'd vanished without trace. She was his current project. His latest victim. He'd been keeping her alive, studying her, hurting her, learning from her fear. When Claire's light hit her face, the woman's eyes opened. Hope and terror mixed in that gaze. Hope that rescue had arrived. Terror that this was a trick, another psychological torture from her captor. Claire whispered reassurances and began working on the chains with a tool from upstairs. The chains were secured with padlocks. Claire searched frantically for keys, found them hanging on a hook near the cellar stairs. She unlocked the restraints and the woman collapsed. Claire caught her, supporting her weight, trying to help her stand. The victim was weak, malnourished, could barely walk. Getting her out of the cabin and through miles of forest to safety seemed impossible. But leaving her wasn't an option. Claire had stumbled into the only chance this woman had for survival. She had to try. Had to get her out. Had to save at least one life from this monster's collection. Nathan and Marcus had been making deliberate noise for 2 hours, creating a trail a child could follow, doing everything possible to draw the killer's attention. It was working. They could hear him behind them now, closing the distance, no longer bothering with stealth or psychological tactics. The hunt had become direct. Physical. A race to see if prey could reach safety before the predator closed the gap. They were still 3 miles from the fire road. Rescue had confirmed they were en route but gave an ETA of 90 minutes. 90 minutes was a lifetime when being chased by a killer through wilderness. They reached a ravine, steep-sided and 50 feet deep, a creek running at the bottom. The GPS showed the fire road was on the other side. They could climb down, cross the creek, climb up the far side. It would slow them significantly, make them vulnerable during the crossing. Or they could follow the ravine edge, looking for an easier crossing point, but that meant more time in the forest, more time being hunted. Behind them, branches cracked. The killer was close now, maybe 200 yards back. They could hear his steady breathing, his unhurried footsteps. He knew they were trapped by terrain. He could take his time. Savor the kill. Make it last. They chose the ravine. Marcus went first, finding handholds in roots and rocks, descending carefully. Nathan followed, trying not to dislodge stones that would clatter down and reveal their exact position. Halfway down, Marcus's foot slipped. He slid 10 feet, gouging his hands on rocks trying to stop, finally catching a root before he fell the rest of the way. Blood ran from his palms. He kept moving, reaching the bottom, starting across the creek. Nathan was right behind him. And above them, at the ravine's edge, the killer appeared. Silhouetted against sky. Rifle in hands. Looking down at them like a god observing insects. The killer raised his rifle, taking careful aim at the 2 men trapped below him in the ravine. They were perfect targets, exposed in the open creek bed with nowhere to hide. Nathan grabbed Marcus and pulled him toward a small overhang in the ravine wall, the only cover available. The rifle cracked once, the bullet striking rock inches from Marcus' head, chips of stone drawing blood across his cheek. The killer worked the bolt, chambering another round. He had all the time in the world. They had seconds. Nathan screamed for Marcus to climb, to move, to do anything. Another shot. this one closer. They scrambled along the ravine floor, using boulders and the overhang for cover, trying to get out of his line of fire. The killer moved along the rim above, tracking them, firing methodically. He wasn't rushing. Wasn't panicking. Each shot was calculated, patient, the work of someone comfortable with killing. A fourth shot struck the water near Marcus' foot. A fifth hit the wall behind Nathan's head. They were being played with, a cat toying with mice before the final kill. Then Nathan saw it, a narrow cut in the ravine wall, almost invisible, leading up and away at an angle that would block the shooter's view. They squeezed into the cut, Marcus going first, Nathan pushing him from behind. The passage was barely wide enough for their bodies, forcing them sideways, scraping skin off shoulders and backs. But it provided cover. The killer's shots couldn't reach them here. They heard him above, running along the rim, trying to get ahead of them, to cut off the passage's exit. They climbed desperately, pulling themselves up using roots and rocks, knowing he'd be waiting wherever this narrow chimney emerged. But staying meant death. Moving meant a chance. They climbed toward whatever waited above. The passage emerged into dense forest on the far side of the ravine. They could see the fire road now, maybe half a mile away through the trees. The killer was somewhere behind them, having lost sight of them temporarily. They ran, abandoning all stealth, crashing through undergrowth, making tremendous noise, betting everything on speed. Branches whipped their faces. Roots tried to trip them. Their lungs burned. Muscles screamed. But they didn't slow down. Behind them, the killer's footsteps resumed, steady and relentless. He was running now too. The final sprint had begun. They burst from the tree line onto the fire road and saw the most beautiful sight of their lives. 2 sheriff's vehicles and an ambulance, lights flashing, parked 100 yards down the road. Officers were exiting vehicles, weapons drawn, responding to the emergency beacon. Nathan and Marcus screamed for help, waving their arms, running toward salvation. The officers saw them, started moving in their direction. And behind Nathan and Marcus, stepping out of the forest with rifle raised, was the killer. He had one last chance to silence his prey before police arrived. He took aim at Nathan's back. The rifle cracked. Nathan felt something punch his shoulder, spinning him around, dropping him to the ground. Marcus dove for cover, screaming that the killer was behind them. The officers opened fire, bullets tearing through the forest where the killer had been standing. Had already moved, dropping into cover behind a fallen log, returning fire with practiced precision. A deputy went down, hit in the leg. Another officer's windshield exploded. This wasn't a surrender. This was a man had always known this day might come and had prepared for it. He was going to kill as many people as possible before they killed him. 2 miles away, Claire heard the gunfire. Multiple weapons, sustained engagement. Nathan and Marcus had reached rescue, but the killer was fighting back. She needed to move faster, needed to get the woman she'd rescued away from the cabin before the killer's allies arrived or before he escaped the police and came back. But the victim could barely walk, kept collapsing, was semi-conscious from dehydration and trauma. Claire half-carried, half-dragged her through the forest, following GPS toward a different fire road to the south. Progress was agonizingly slow. Every 100 yards took 5 minutes. And she had miles to go. The woman collapsed completely after half a mile. Claire couldn't move her any further alone. She used the satellite communicator to send an emergency message with their exact coordinates, explaining she had a rescued victim who needed immediate medical evacuation. The response was quick, helicopter dispatch approved, ETA 30 minutes. But 30 minutes was not eternity. The gunfire to the north had stopped. Either the killer was dead, captured, or had escaped. If had escaped, had come back to the cabin. Find his victim missing. Track Claire and the woman. Finish what had started. They needed to hide until the helicopter arrived. Claire found a dense thicket and pulled the woman inside, covering them both with branches and ferns. She held the woman close, feeling her rapid heartbeat, her shallow breathing. This person had survived 3 weeks of torture. had endured horrors Claire couldn't imagine. And she was going to make it out alive. Had to make it out. Justice demanded it. The helicopter sound grew louder, the distinctive thump of rotors cutting air. Claire activated a signal flare. Orange smoke billowed into the sky, marking their position. The helicopter banked toward them. Rescue was seconds away. At the fire road, the gunfight had ended. The killer had fired his last round, then retreated into the forest, vanishing like smoke. Officers pursued but lost his trail within minutes. He knew this wilderness intimately, had escape routes prepared, could disappear completely if given any head start. Nathan was being loaded into an ambulance, his shoulder wound serious but not life-threatening. Marcus was giving a statement to detectives, explaining about the cabin, the evidence, the victims. Police were organizing a massive response, search teams, K-9 units, helicopter support. But everyone knew the truth. The killer had a significant head start in terrain he controlled. Finding him would be nearly impossible. Then a radio call came in. A hiker had been rescued 2 miles south with a victim from the cabin. A woman kept alive in the cellar. Still breathing, still coherent, able to identify her captor. And the hiker who had rescued her had photographed everything in the cabin, uploaded it all to cloud storage before the killer could destroy evidence. They had documentation of 17 murders. Physical proof. Eyewitness testimony. Even if the killer escaped into the wilderness, even if he was never caught, his crimes were exposed. His victims were identified. Families would have answers. Justice could begin, even without him in custody. The search for the killer lasted 2 weeks. Over 300 law enforcement personnel from multiple agencies combed the forest. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns. K-9 units tracked scent trails. SWAT teams cleared the cabin and surrounding areas. They found more evidence, additional burial sites, hidden caches of supplies. A network of trails and shelters had maintained across hundreds of square miles. The forest had been his kingdom for years. Had killed, tortured, and buried victims with impunity, confident in his isolation. But his kingdom was being dismantled, mapped, documented, transformed from hunting ground to crime scene. They recovered 12 of the 17 bodies. DNA identification confirmed victims who'd been missing for years. Families were notified. Burial sites became recovery operations. Each victim was treated with dignity, removed from unmarked forest graves and returned to loved ones who'd never stopped searching. The killer had stolen their lives, but he couldn't steal their names anymore. Couldn't keep them as anonymous trophies. They were people again. Daughters and sons. Sisters and brothers. Friends and lovers. Remembered. Mourned. Honored. But the killer himself was never found. Despite the massive search, despite the resources devoted, despite checking every known shelter and trail system, Head vanished completely. Either Head died in the wilderness from injuries sustained in the gunfight, or Head escaped to a new territory, started over somewhere else. The investigation remained open. His photograph was distributed nationally. Alerts were sent to wilderness areas across the country. But months passed with no credible sightings. The man who'd lived in the woods had become a ghost, hunted but never caught. 6 months after the incident, the woman Claire rescued from the cellar was still in physical therapy, relearning how to walk properly after weeks of confinement. Her name was Jennifer Carter, age 28, a wildlife photographer who'd been hiking alone when the killer abducted her. She had endured 23 days of captivity before Claire found her. The physical scars would fade eventually. The psychological ones never would. But she was alive. 17 others hadn't been that fortunate. Jennifer attended every funeral she could, honoring the victims who'd shared her fate but hadn't survived it. Nathan's shoulder had healed, the bullet removed successfully, nerve damage minimal. But Head stopped hiking. Stopped going into wilderness. The forest that had been his sanctuary had become a source of nightmares. Head returned to emergency room work with new perspective on violence and survival, treating patients with enhanced empathy born from his own trauma. Marcus had the opposite reaction. He hiked more than ever, driven by a need to reclaim the wilderness, to prove it wasn't all hunting grounds and killers. Claire had become an advocate for missing hikers, working with families, organizing searches, refusing to let victims be forgotten. Jennifer provided testimony that helped investigators understand the killer's methods. Head watched her for 3 days before abducting her, learning her routines, waiting until she camped alone in a remote location. The attack had been quick, professional, using a tranquilizer dart that dropped her before she could scream. She'd woken in the cellar, chained, with him standing over her explaining in clinical detail what he planned to do. Head called it research. Said he was studying human psychology under extreme stress. Testing how long different people could maintain hope before breaking completely. He was intelligent, articulate, and completely inhuman in his emotional capacity. Jennifer described 17 days of psychological torture before the physical abuse began. Head talked to her for hours, asking questions about her life, her fears, her family, then used that information to craft torments specific to her psychology. Head show her photographs of previous victims, explain how long each had lasted, make her guess which number she'd be in his collection. On day 20, Head started the physical torture. Tools from his table. Precise. Methodical. Designed to maximize pain while avoiding fatal damage. He wanted her to last weeks, maybe months. She'd been days from death when Claire found her. FBI behavioral analysts constructed a profile from the evidence. The killer was likely between 40 and 55 years old, former military based on the precision and discipline evident in his methods, probably dishonorably discharged. Had been living in the forest for at least 8 years, possibly longer. The cabin was a second-generation structure, suggesting Head built an earlier shelter that became compromised, leading to relocation and the construction of the more sophisticated setup. Head survived entirely off-grid, hunting, foraging, using solar power and satellite internet to monitor news about his victims. His journal revealed a frightening level of intelligence and planning. Each victim was selected based on specific criteria: solo hikers or small groups in remote areas, people who'd filed minimal route plans or none at all, individuals whose disappearance might be attributed to natural causes. Head studied search and rescue patterns, understanding how investigations worked, deliberately choosing victims whose cases would go cold quickly. Head researched missing person statistics, knowing that in wilderness disappearances, bodies were often never recovered. Head turned probability and human psychology into weapons. 3 theories emerged about his fate. Theory 1. Head died from injuries sustained in a gunfight with police, his body hidden in some remote section of forest where it might never be found. Bears, decomposition, and time would erase all evidence. Theory 2. Head successfully escaped to a new territory, possibly another state or even another country, where Head established a new hunting ground and resumed killing. Theory 3, and the most disturbing, he was still in the same forest, watching, waiting, learning from his mistakes, preparing to start again with improved methods that wouldn't be discovered until Head claimed many more victims. Reported sightings came in weekly. Hikers who saw someone matching his description in various wilderness areas across the country. Most were false alarms, fearful people seeing threats in innocent strangers. But some were harder to dismiss. A hermit encountered in Oregon who fled when approached. A man matching the killer's build spotted near a remote cabin in Montana. Boot prints found near an abandoned campsite in Colorado, the pattern consistent with prints from the original crime scene. Each lead was investigated. Each led nowhere. The killer, if he was alive, had become invisible again. The case changed wilderness culture permanently. Solo hiking decreased by 30% in the year following the discovery of the cabin. Trail registries became mandatory in more parks. Satellite communicators became standard equipment rather than optional luxury. Hiking forums filled with debates about safety versus fear, about reclaiming wilderness versus acknowledging its dangers. The killer had succeeded in something beyond his victim count, had poisoned the relationship between humans and wild places, introducing suspicion and fear where once there was only wonder and peace. Support groups formed for people affected by the case. Jennifer led many of these sessions, transforming her victimhood into purpose. Nathan, Marcus, and Claire attended regularly, processing their guilt over surviving while others hadn't, their fear that the killer might return for them, their struggle to reconcile the beauty they'd always found in nature with the horror they'd discovered there. Other families attended too, parents of the 17 identified victims, siblings and friends, people whose loved ones were still missing and might be among the 5 bodies never recovered. 1 year after the incident, a hiker found something disturbing near a remote trail in Washington state, 800 miles from the original cabin. A note, wrapped in plastic, buried in a cairn of stones. The note was addressed to Jennifer Carter by name. It thanked her for the experience she'd provided. Apologized for the interruption of their time together. Promised they'd meet again when circumstances allowed. The handwriting matched samples from the killer's journal. He was alive. He was watching. He remembered. And he was planning. The note triggered a new investigation, focused on the Pacific Northwest. But it also triggered something else, a realization that some predators were too intelligent, too patient, too adaptive to be caught by conventional means. The killer had survived in wilderness for years before being discovered. Had evaded a massive manhunt. Had relocated successfully. And had made contact to prove he was still active, still confident, still hunting. The note was a taunt. A promise. A declaration that the story wasn't over. Last month, 3 hikers went missing in Olympic National Forest. Their tent was found intact, supplies untouched, no signs of struggle. Just empty sleeping bags and abandoned gear. Searchers found boot prints circling the campsite, large prints, the pattern consistent with a sole design popular with military surplus boots. The investigation is ongoing. The connection to the original case hasn't been confirmed. But the families of those 3 hikers have received letters. Handwritten. Apologetic. Promising their loved ones are part of important research. The letters contain details only the missing people would know. Analysts are now reviewing unsolved missing hiker cases across the western United States spanning the last 15 years. Patterns are emerging. Clusters of disappearances in specific wilderness areas, then long periods of nothing, then new clusters hundreds of miles away. The pattern suggests a single operator, mobile, intelligent, patient. The same operator. Had been killing for years before the cabin was found. The 17 victims weren't his total. They were just the ones documented in that location. His actual victim count might be twice that. 3 times. Maybe more. And he's still out there. If you hike in remote wilderness, if you camp in areas where humans rarely venture, if you seek solitude in places far from help, understand this, you might not be alone. Someone might be watching from the trees. Learning your patterns. Studying your routines. Deciding if you fit his criteria. The serial killer who lived in the woods didn't stop living in woods when his first cabin was found. He just moved. Built again. Started over. And somewhere tonight, in some dark forest, he's walking a perimeter around a campsite. Watching people sleep. Choosing his next victim. The question isn't if he'll kill again. The question is, will it be you? Sleep well, campers. And if you hear footsteps outside your tent tonight, don't look outside. Don't investigate. Don't assume it's wildlife. Because in some forests, in the darkest places where humans rarely go, the most dangerous predator walks on 2 legs. And he's been hunting much longer than you've been alive. The killer lived in the woods. He still does. And he's waiting for you.